Some houses grow hungry during construction, feeding on the work itself until the walls breathe with borrowed life. Marcus arrived at the Hendersons' house before sunrise, as he always did. 23 years in construction had taught him that the early hours belonged to the serious work, before phone calls, before interruptions, before the world woke up and complicated things. He unlocked the side gate and walked around to the back of the house, where his extension project waited. The addition was meant to be simple, a sunroom connecting the kitchen to the back garden. Clean lines, natural light, honest craftsmanship, the kind of work that still mattered. Marcus set his coffee on the sawhorses and pulled out his measuring tape. Yesterday he framed the west wall, 8 feet, 6 inches. Standard residential height. He'd measured it 3 times as he always did. But standing there in the pale morning light, something felt off. He ran the tape along the wall. 8 feet, 7 inches. Then again, 8 feet, 7.5 inches. Marcus frowned. Tape measures didn't lie, but eyes could play tricks in different light. Still, he'd been doing this long enough to trust his hands more than his eyes. The wall felt different, thicker, somehow. He moved to his tool belt, hung exactly where he'd left it on the center stud, except it wasn't on the center stud. It hung 2 inches to the left, on a nail that hadn't been there yesterday. Marcus stared at the nail, clean, new, driven flush. Professional work. Henderson must have had someone else out here, he muttered, though the clients had never mentioned hiring additional help. He lifted his hammer. The handle felt warm, though it had been sitting in the cool morning air. The weight was wrong too, heavier than usual, as if the metal had somehow gained mass overnight. Marcus turned it over in his hands. Same manufacturer's mark, same wear patterns from years of use, but it felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. The sound of creaking wood made him look up. Old houses settled constantly, but this was different. Rhythmic. Dots. Almost like breathing. The fresh lumber he'd installed yesterday shouldn't be making any noise at all. Marcus walked along the frame, running his hand over each joint. His fingers caught on something that shouldn't be there. A slight ridge in the wood, as if the grain had risen overnight. He knelt down and examined the 2x4 more closely. The ridge ran the length of the board, following no natural grain pattern he recognized. He pressed his thumb against it. The wood gave slightly, like pressing into flesh. But when he lifted his thumb, there was no depression. The ridge remained, but now it seemed to pulse under his skin. Marcus stepped back. In 2 decades of construction, he'd seen wood warp, expand, contract, and rot. He'd seen foundations shift and walls crack, but he'd never seen lumber behave like living tissue. Coffee was getting cold. The morning was getting away from him. Whatever was happening here, there was work to be done. Marcus picked up his circular saw and checked the blade. Sharp as yesterday, but when he tested the trigger, the motor's whine seemed deeper than usual, almost mournful. He looked back at the wall that was somehow an inch taller than it should be. Professional pride demanded answers, but something deeper, something that had kept him alive through 23 years of dangerous work, whispered that some questions weren't meant to be asked. Marcus plugged in the saw anyway. By 10 o'clock, Marcus had measured the same wall 6 times. Each measurement was different. Not by much, 1/8 of an inch here, 1/4 there, but enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about his own work. He'd been framing walls since he was 19. He could cut a 2x4 to within 1/16 of an inch by eye alone. But every board he cut this morning came up short or long, never the measurement he intended. The saw seemed to have its own ideas about where to cut. Worse, the wood felt wrong under the blade. Instead of the clean resistance of seasoned lumber, each cut felt soft, almost wet. The saw would bind for a moment, then push through with a sound like tearing fabric. When he pulled the blade free, fresh sawdust fell to the ground, but it wasn't the pale yellow of pine. It was darker, with an amber tint that caught the light like honey. Marcus knelt and scooped up a handful. The dust was warm and slightly sticky, clinging to his fingers like tree sap. When he rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, it left a residue that smelled like copper and something else. Something organic and alive. A sound behind him made him turn. Fresh sawdust was falling from the ceiling joists he'd installed yesterday, falling in a steady stream, as if someone was working above him. But there was no one above him. The second floor wasn't even framed yet. Marcus stood slowly, wiping his hands on his work pants. The sawdust kept falling, forming small amber pyramids on the plywood subfloor. He walked over and looked up. The joists appeared solid, unchanged from yesterday. But as he watched, more dust spiraled down like golden snow. He reached up and touched the nearest joist. The wood was warm. Not sun warm or friction warm, but body warm, as if heated from within. His finger came away sticky with the amber resin. The hammer in his belt grew heavier. Marcus pulled it out and stared at it. The claw end seemed different, longer, more curved, like it was adapting to grip things better. When he wrapped his fingers around the handle, it felt slick, coated with the same amber substance as the sawdust. He swung the hammer at a piece of scrap wood. The impact felt wrong. Instead of the solid thunk of metal on lumber, it made a wet, meaty sound. The scrap wood didn't split cleanly. It tore, revealing fibers that looked more like muscle than grain. Marcus dropped the hammer. It hit the subfloor with a sound like something sighing. The wall he'd been measuring was definitely taller now. Not by much, maybe 2 inches, but enough that his carefully calculated plans no longer fit. The header beam was too short. The window rough-in was at the wrong height. 23 years of experience told him this was impossible, but his eyes told him it was happening anyway. He picked up his tape measure and extended it along the wall one more time. 8 feet, 10 inches. As he watched, the metal tape seemed to stretch, the numbers blurring slightly. When he retracted it, the tape was warm to the touch and left amber residue on his fingers. The house was breathing around him now. He could feel it in the slight movement of the floor, see it in the almost imperceptible expansion and contraction of the walls. His tools were changing, adapting, becoming something other than what they'd been when he'd packed them in his truck that morning. Marcus looked toward his truck, parked in the driveway 40 feet away. It seemed very far away. Marcus grabbed his reciprocating saw. If the house wanted to play games with measurements, he'd tear down the problem section and start over. 23 years had taught him that sometimes the only solution was to go back to the foundation and rebuild. The saw felt heavier than it should, but the weight was reassuring. Honest steel and motors didn't lie. He pulled the trigger and the blade whirred to life, vibrating with familiar mechanical violence. He pressed the blade against the wall stud that had grown too tall. The saw bit into the wood, but instead of the clean, aggressive cutting he expected, it felt like pushing through thick rubber. The blade barely made progress, and with each stroke, the wood seemed to push back. Then the bleeding started. Thick amber resin welled up from the cut, flowing over the saw blade and dripping onto the subfloor. It wasn't tree sap. This was darker, more viscous, with the consistency of honey, but the smell of copper and rust coated the saw blade, making it slip and bind. Marcus pulled the trigger harder, forcing the blade deeper. The resin flowed faster, pooling around his boots. Where it touched his skin, it felt warm and slightly electric, like touching a low-voltage fence. The wood groaned. Not the creaking of lumber under stress, but something deeper. Something that sounded almost like pain. Marcus yanked the saw free and stepped back. The cut he'd made was already closing. Not healing, closing. The wood fibers were drawing together like muscle tissue, sealing the wound. In 30 seconds, there was no trace of where the blade had been. He swung his hammer at the wall. It stuck. The claw end embedded in the wood like an axe in a tree, but when he tried to pull it free, the wall held on. The wood had closed around the hammerhead, gripping it with surprising strength. Marcus braced his foot against the wall and pulled. The hammer came free with a wet sucking sound, but the handle was now coated with amber resin. His hand stuck to it, the substance acting like glue between his skin and the tool. Panic fluttered in his chest. Professional contractors didn't panic. But professional contractors worked with materials that obeyed the laws of physics. He looked around the construction site. The walls were definitely higher now, at least a foot taller than they should be. The door frame he'd installed yesterday was narrower, forcing him to turn sideways to fit through. And the ceiling, Christ, the ceiling was lower. He could almost touch it without stretching. The house was shrinking around him. Marcus ran for the opening where the exterior door would eventually be installed. It was smaller than it had been an hour ago, but still big enough to squeeze through. But as he reached it, the opening began to contract. The header beam was dropping. The side studs were moving inward, like a mouth slowly closing. He threw himself forward, shoulder first, hitting the narrowing gap just as it squeezed shut behind him. The wood felt warm against his back as he pushed through, and he could swear he heard something like a sigh as he broke free. Marcus stumbled into the backyard, gasping. His hands were still coated with the amber resin, and his tools, hammer, saw, tape measure, were embedded in his belt like they'd grown there. When he tried to remove the hammer, pain shot up his arm. The tool was becoming part of him. Behind him, the house settled with a sound like contentment. The opening he'd escaped through was gone, sealed over with fresh lumber that looked like it had been there for years. Marcus sat in his truck for 20 minutes, staring at the house. From the outside, everything looked normal. The extension frame stood exactly as it should, 8 feet, 6 inches tall, standard residential proportions. Clean, professional work. The kind of job he'd be proud to show other contractors. His hands had stopped sticking to things, but the amber resin had left permanent stains on his palms. Dark, golden lines that followed the creases in his skin, like a road map of somewhere he'd never been. He started the engine and drove home without looking back. 3 days later, Mrs. Henderson called. The extension was finished, she said. Overnight, apparently. She sounded delighted. The workmanship was extraordinary, she told him. So organic, so natural. The way the wood grain flowed together, you'd think it had grown that way. Marcus tried to explain that he hadn't finished the work, that there had been problems with the measurements, that something was wrong with the house. Mrs. Henderson laughed. She'd seen it herself that morning. Complete, perfect, exactly what she'd wanted. Better even. She paid him through Venmo while they talked. A week passed before Marcus worked up the courage to drive by. He parked across the street and stared at the extension. It was beautiful. The sunroom connected seamlessly to the original house, with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the afternoon light perfectly. The wood grain flowed in patterns that seemed almost alive, organic curves that drew the eye and held it. His tools were there, embedded in the walls like fossils in amber. His hammer had become part of a support beam, the handle disappearing into the wood grain as if it had grown there. His tape measure was stretched along the baseboard, its metal body gleaming through the clear finish. His circular saw hung suspended in what looked like a decorative wall feature, its blade catching reflections from the windows. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the sunroom carrying a cup of coffee. She saw him and waved, gesturing for him to come inside. Marcus shook his head and drove away. That night, he threw out his remaining tools. Every saw, hammer, and tape measure went into the dumpster behind Home Depot. He told his wife he was retiring, effective immediately. 23 years was enough. But the amber stains on his hands never faded, and sometimes, late at night, he could feel the phantom weight of his old hammer hanging from his belt. The tool he'd carried for 15 years, now part of someone else's wall, still connected to him in ways he didn't want to understand. 6 months later, Marcus saw a news article online. The Hendersons were selling their house. Moving to Florida, they said. The extension was beautiful, but they'd started hearing sounds at night. Rhythmic sounds, like someone working with tools. Hammering, sawing, measuring. The sounds came from inside the walls. Marcus closed the laptop and looked at his hands. The amber stains seemed darker today, more pronounced. And for just a moment he could swear he felt the ghost of wood grain beneath his fingers, warm and alive, and waiting for him to come back to work. Somewhere across town, in a sunroom that had finished building itself, his tools waited in their wooden graves, still part of the job that would never truly be complete.